She walked into that police station with tears streaking her cheeks, and a question no child should ever have to ask. Do all fathers treat their kids like mine does? What came next wasn't just an answer. It was the start of a journey. To show her that love ain't something you earn, it's something you deserve. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us from where in the world you're watching from. The Walker house sat at the end of Maple Street, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. White picket fence that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. A birch swing that squeaked in the wind but never held anyone anymore. And windows that seemed to stare out at the world with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't always that way. Lord knows it wasn't always that way. 3.5 years before that rainy April morning, Claire Walker had been the kind off woman who could make sunshine jealous. She'd dance around that kitchen while macking pancakes on Saturday mornings, her red hair catching the light like fire, little Sophie giggling and spinning right alongside her mama. The house used to smell like vanilla and hope back then. Used to sound like home. But cancer. Well, cancer don't care about dreams and breakfast. Dances. It just takes and talks until there's nothing left but memories and the echo of laughter that's been swallowed bissolence. When Claire Walker breathed her last breath on a cold February morning, she took more than just herself with her. She took Richard's ability to see joy as anything other than a betrayal of his grief. She took Sophie's understanding of love as something freely given instead of carefully earned. And in that house on Maple Street, love became a ration, doled out. In careful measurements like medicine, just enough to keep you alive, never enough to make you feel truly well. Richard had always been a quiet man, but after Claire died, quiet became silent. Silent became a cold. And cold? Well, cold became a wall that grew higher every day between a father who was drowning in his own sorrow and a daughter who was learning to apologize for breathing too loud. Sophie tried. Lord bless her little heart. She tried in all the ways an 8-year-old knows how. She'd clean her room without being asked, set the table perfect straight, fold her little clothes neat as Sunday prayers. She had this behavior chart on the refrigerator. Gold stars for buying wheat, silver stars for not asking for seconds at dinner, blue stars for going to bed without needing a story. Stars for shrinking herself down small enough to fit inside her. Daddy's broken heart, without bumping against the jagged edges. But here's the thing about trying to earn love that should be given free. It's like trying to catch water with your bare hands. The harder you squeeze, the more it slips away. Richard would come home from his job at the hardware store, shoulders bent under the weight of just making it through another day. He'd nod at Sophie's homework spread neat across the kitchen table, grunt approval at the way she'd already fixed herself a peanut butter sandwich for dinner, and disappear into his workshop where he'd sand pieces of wood until they were smooth as glass, like he was trying to sand the rough edges off his own broken heart. Sophie would sit at that kitchen table, doing homework by herself, eating dinner by herself, going to bed by herself, and wondering why other kids at school talked about daddy hugs and bedtime stories, when her daddy seemed to flinch every time she got too close. She'd lie in her little bed at night, clutching her stuffed elephant Mr. Wrinkles, and whisper questions to the darkness. Mama, did I do something wrong? Is that why Daddy don't smile no more? Is that why you had to go away? The thing is, Richard wasn't meaning to be cruel. He was just so scared of losing Sophie Toothit. He figured if he didn't get too attached, if he didn't love too hard, maybe, life wouldn't be a Blado take her away from him like it took Claire. He thought he was protecting them both from more heartbreak, but protection can become prison awful quick when you're too afraid to live. And Sophie? She was learning lessons no child should ever have to learn. That love was conditional, that her needs were burdens, that if she was just good enough, quiet enough, perfect enough, Maybe her daddy would remember how to love her again. That maybe if she was perfect enough, God would even bring her mama back. For 3 years, they lived like ghosts in that house, haunting. The same rooms, sharing thesome air, but never really touching each other's hearts. Richard convinced himself he was being a good father by providing food, shelter, clothes. Sophie convinced herself she was being a good daughter by never asking. For more than the bare minimum of attention, got both of them slowly starving in different ways. But children, well, children have spirits that refuse to be dimmed forever, no matter how dark the house gets. And eventually, something in Sophie's little heart said, enough. That something led her to put on her yellow raincoat on that storm-dark April morning and walk 12 blocks through the rain to ask 5 words that would change everything. Asterisk. April 7th, 2019. The kind of spring day that can't decide if it wants to be winter or summer, so it throws rain like bullets and wind like fists at anything standing still. Most folks stayed inside that morning, nursing coffee and watching the weather through their windows. But 8-year-old Sophie Walker was walking through that storm like she was carrying a message too. Important to wait for Sunshine. Officer Maria Grayson had been working at Millbrook Police Department for 15 years. Ensch thought she'd seen everything small-town Georgia had to offer. Domestic disputes and drunk drivers, lost cats and found wallets, the occasional teenage prank that got out of hand. Nothing too dramatic, nothing too heartbreaking. She was filling out paperwork in the waiting area when she heard the front door struggle against wind and finally give way. In walked this little slip of a girl, yellow raincoat dripping puddles in the linoleum, dark hair plastered to her head, clutching a stuffed elephant like it was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. Maria looked up from her files, and something in her chest went tight. The child wasn't hurt, no visible bruises, no obvious distress, but there was something in those big brown eyes that spoke of wounds that don't show on the outside. "Honey, you all right?" Maria asked, setting down her pen and giving the girl her full attention. "You lost or something?" Sophie stood there for a moment, water dripping from her coat, looking around the police station like she was trying to decide if this was really the right place for whatever she'd come to do. Then she walked over to where Maria was sitting, climbed up onto the plastic chair beside her, and spoke 5 words that would haunt that building for years to come. "Does every daddy act like mine?" Now, Maria had heard children ask difficult questions before. She'd worked cases involving abuse, neglect, family troubles of all kinds. But something about the way Sophie asked that question, not angry, not scared, just ... curious, like she genuinely didn't know if what she was experiencing was normal, that hit Maria somewhere deep. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Maria asked, her training kicking in. "Tell me about your daddy." And Sophie, holding Mr. Wrinkles tight against her chest, began to paint a picture of life in a who's, where love had become conditional. "My daddy don't like hugs much," she said, her voice small but steady. "He says they make him feel, I can't remember the word, sad, angry? Mama used to hug me all the time, but Daddy says that's 'cause she was soft, and now she's gone, and I gotta learn to be strong." Maria felt something cold settling in her stomach. "Does your daddy hurt you, honey?" Sophie shook her head quickly. "No, ma'am. He don't hit or nothing. He just ... He don't like when I'm too loud or when I need things. I got a chart on the refrigerator, and when I get enough stars for being good, maybe he'll remember how to smile at me again." "What kind of stars?" Maria asked, though she was starting to get a sick feeling about where this was going. "Gold ones for staying quiet during his TV shows. Silver ones for not asking questions when he's tired. Blue ones for eating all my dinner, even when my tummy's full. And red ones." Sophie's voice got even smaller. "Red ones for not crying when I miss Mama." Maria had to take a deep breath to keep her own voice steady. Sophie, baby, how did you get there today? I walked. Daddy's at work, and I was supposed to be at school, but I had to ask somebody something real important, and I thought maybe police officers would know the answer, 'cause if they help people. What did you need to ask? And there it was again, those 5 words that would echo through that building like a bell that couldn't stop ringing. Does every daddy act like mine? Maria looked at this little girl, this child who was asking if emotional starvation was normal. Furning scraps of affection was just how families worked, and something inside her broke open like a dam. No, honey, she said, her voice thick with tears she was trying to hold back. No, they don't. That's when Sophie's composure finally cracked. Not into sobs or hysterics, but into something almost worse. A kind of relief mixed with confusion that made her whole body shake, double quotes. Then, then something's wrong with mine. Something's wrong with your daddy's heart, baby girl. But that's not your fault. That's not something you did or didn't do. Sometimes grown-ups get so hurt, they forget how to show love the right way. Maria was already reaching for her phone to call child services when the station door flew open again. Richard Walker stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his work clothes, his face a mixture of panic and anger. Sophie, what the hell are you doing here? You're supposed to be in school. The change in Sophie was immediate and heartbreaking. She shrank down in her chair, clutching Mr. Wrinkles so tight her knuckles went white, and that careful, practiced mask-off effect behavior slid over her face like armor. I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm real sorry. I just wanted to ask a question, and I'll go to school right now, and I won't bother nobody else. And, Mr. Walker, Maria interrupted, standing up and placing herself between Richard and Sophie. I'm Officer Grayson. Your daughter came here with some concerns about your family situation. Richard's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Concerns? What kind of concerns? I provide for her. I keep her fed and clothed, and, sir, that's not what this is about. Then, what is it about? Because if she's been telling stories, making up some nonsense about, Daddy, please don't be mad, Sophie whispered from behind Maria. I didn't tell no stories. I just asked if other daddies act like you, and she said no, and I'm sorry. I asked, but I just want to talk no if maybe I was doing something wrong that made you not love me anymore. The silence that followed that statement was the kind that seems to suck all the air out of Oro. Richard stared at his daughter like she'd spoken in a language he'd never heard before. Maria watched a man's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been horror. Not love you? He finally whispered. Sophie, baby. What do you mean? You don't hug me. You don't read me stories. You get sad when I laugh too loud. Mama used to say, love was like sunshine, but yours feels like winter all the time. And right there, in the waiting area of Millbrook Police Department, surrounded by wanted posters and safety pamphlets, Richard Walker got his first real look at what his grief had been doing to his daughter. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Asterisk. You know what they say about the road to hell being paved with good intentions? Well, Richard Walker's house was built on those same stones. When Child Services caseworker Janet Morrison arrived at the Walker home 3 hours later, she came expecting to find evidence of the usual suspects: abuse, neglect, dangerous living conditions. What she found instead was something harder to document, but no less damaging. She found a house that was clean but cold, organized but empty, safe but suffocating. She found a refrigerator covered not with children's artwork or family photos, but with a behavior chart that looked more like a business ledger than anything belonging in a home with an 8-year-old. Gold star? Quiet during dinner? Janet read aloud, her voice carefully neutral, as Richard sat at his kitchen table looking like a man who'd been asked to explain mathematics in a language he'd never learned. I was trying to teach her discipline, Richard said, his hands folding and unfolding on the table. Structure. My wife was... Claire was the one who did all the ... The emotional stuff. I don't know how to. Mr. Walker, can you tell me about Sophie's daily routine? Richard straightened up a bit, seeming more confident with his practical question. She gets up at 7, fixes herself cereal, brushes her teeth, gets dressed for school. I drive her on my way to work. After school, she walks to Mrs. Henderson's next door until I get home at 6. She does her homework at the kitchen table while I make dinner. We eat, she helps clean up, then she goes to her room to read until bedtime at 8:30. Janet made notes, but her expression remained carefully blank. And weekends? Saturdays she helps me with chores around the house. Sundays we go grocery shopping, meal prep for the week. She's very good about keeping herself occupied. When do? You play together? Read stories? Talk about her day? Richard looked genuinely confused by the question. Play? She's 8 years old enough to entertain herself. And we talk. I ask about her grades. Make sure she's not having problems at school. ... double quotes. But what about just ... talking? About her feelings, her friends, things she's interested in? The confusion deepened. I don't know how to do that kind of thing. Claire was better with all the ... the talking and the feelings. I make sure she has what she needs. Janet set down her pen and looked at this man, really looked at him. She saw the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed permanently bent under some invisible weight, the careful distance he maintained, even from furniture in his own home, as if he was afraid of getting too comfortable anywhere. Mr. Walker, when was the last time you hugged your daughter? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I done single quotes T ... He rubbed his face with his hands. I don't remember. Can you tell? Me why? And here's where Richard's pain finally started spilling over the careful walls he built around it. Because every time I look at her, I see Claire. Every time she smiles, it's Claire's smile. Every time she laughs. His voice broke. How am I supposed to love her laugh when it sounds just like the one that went quiet 3 years ago? How am I supposed to hug her when it just reminds me of what I lost? Janet had seen a lot of broken families in her 15 years of social work, but this was different. This wasn't malice or addiction or abuse in any traditional sense. This was a man who loved his daughter so much that his grief over losing his wife had twisted that love into something irreconcilable. So you kept your distance. I kept her safe, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. I thought if I didn't get too attached, if I didn't let her get too attached to me, then when something happens to me, it won't hurt her as bad as it hurt me when Claire died. Mr. Walker, can I ask you something? What do you think your wife would say about how you've been raising Sophie? Richard's face crumpled. She'd hate it. She'd hate me. Claire always said. She used to tell Sophie that love wasn't something you had to earn. It was something that just was, like breathing, like sunshine. He looked up at Janet with eyes full of tears he'd been holding back for 3 years. I turned my daughter into a stranger in her own home, didn't I? Before Janet could answer, a small voice came from the doorway. Daddy? Sophie stood there in her school clothes, having been picked up by Mrs. Henderson after the police station incident. She held Mr. Wrinkles in one hand and looked uncertain about whether she was allowed to come into her own kitchen. Can I ask you something? Richard nodded. not trusting his voice. Were you keeping yourself safe from me too? The question was asked with such innocent clarity that both adults felt it like a knife through Thetis. Oh, baby girl, ... Richard whispered, and for the first time in 3 years, he opened his arms. Sophie looked at those open arms, like they might be a trap, like good behavior that could be taken away if she moved too fast or loved too hard. But slowly, carefully, she walked across that kitchen and let herself be held by a father who was finally ready to remember how ... they both cried then. Richard cried for 3 years of distance and all the hugs he'd been too afraid to give. Sophie cried for 3 years of walking on eggshells and believing that love was something you had to earn with good behavior. But crying, as it turns out, was just the beginning. Healing, friend, isn't like fixing a broken bone. You can't just set it in a cast and wait 6 weeks for everything to mend. Healing the kind of wounds that live in the heart, that's more like learning to walk again after you've forgotten how got Richard. Walker got 2 choices from the state of Georgia: complete a court-ordered parenting program and family therapy, or lose custody of Sophie to foster care. For a man who'd spent 3 years afraid of losing his daughter, the decision should have been easy. But fear has a way of making even the simplest choices feel impossible. What if I'm no good at it? He asked Janet Morrison during their first meeting with the family therapist, Dr. Elizabeth Chun. What if I do it wrong? What if I hurt her worse by trying and failing? Dr. Chun was a small woman with kind eyes and the patience of someone who'd seen broken families put themselves back together one conversation at a time. Mr. Walker, she said, what do you think you're doing now? What do you mean? By not trying. By keeping your distance. What do you think that's doing to Sophie? Richard looked over at his daughter, who was sitting in a chair that was too big for her, swinging her legs and coloring in a book that had pictures of families doing normal family things, playing catch, reading stories, hugging goodbye. I think I'm hurting her anyway. So your choice isn't between hurting her and not hurting her. Your choice is between hurting her on purpose or hurting her by accident while you learn how to love her better. Sophie looked up from her coloring book. Daddy, are you going to learn how to hug without looking sad? And right there, in that therapy office that smelled like vanilla candles and fresh tissues, Richard Walker made the first brave choice he'd made in 3 years. Yeah, baby girl, I'm gonna learn. What followed were the hardest and most important months of both their lives. Dr. Chun started with basics. How to have a conversation with a child that wasn't about chorus or homework. How to listen to stories about school friends and playground drama without immediately trying to solve or dismiss every problem. How to show interest in the small things that make up a child's world. Sophie, Dr. Chun said during one of their sessions, tell your daddy about your favorite thing that happened this week. Sophie glanced at Richard nervously. 3 years of behavior charts had taught her to only share things that wouldn't cause trouble. It's okay, Richard said, though his voice was still stiff with unfamiliarity. You can tell me anything. Well, ... Sophie began carefully. At recess, me and Emma found a caterpillar on the playground. It was green and fuzzy, and when you touched it real gentle, it curled up like a tiny green donut. Emma said it was gross, but I thought it was magic. Richard's first instinct was to say something practical about washing hands after touching bugs. But Dr. Chun had been working with him on recognizing those impulses and choosing different responses. That does sound magic, he said instead. What did you do with it? Sophie's face lit up, the first real smile Richard had seen from her in longer than he could remember. We moved it to the garden by the school so it wouldn't get stepped on. And Emma said maybe it'll turn into a butterfly, and we can watch for it next spring. I'd like to hear about it if you see the butterfly. Really? Really. It was a small conversation, maybe 3 minutes total. But for Sophie, It was the first time in 3 years that her daddy had shown interest in something that mattered to her, without trying to turn it into a lesson about being careful or responsible. For Richard, it was the first time he'd seen his daughter as a person with her own thoughts and feelings and experiences. Instead of a responsibility, he needed to manage Dot, but progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves like gravity, pulling them back down. Like the evening Sophie came home from school, crying because a boy in her class had been mean to her friend Emma. Richard's immediate response was the one that had been programmed by 3 years of emotional distance. Stop crying. It's not your problem. Go wash up for dinner. Sophie's face shuddered closed again, all that progress seeming to evaporate in an instant. She wiped her tears and nodded. Yes, Daddy. But then Richard remembered Dr. Chun's voice. When you shut down her emotions, you shut down her trust. Wait, he called after Sophie as she headed toward her room. Come back here. Sophie turned around, looking scared that she'd done something wrong. I want you to tell me what happened. And crying ... crying's okay. Sometimes things are worth crying about. So Sophie sat at the kitchen table and told her daddy about how Jason Morrison had called Emma stupid because she wore glasses, and how it made Sophie feel angry and sad because Emma was the smartest person she knew and also the kindest. Richard, instead of offering solutions or dismissing her feelings, just listened. Then he said, That sounds really hard. You're a good friend for caring about Emma. I didn't know what to do, though. I wanted to tell Jason he was wrong, but I was scared he'd be mean to me, too. Being scared doesn't make you weak, Sophie. It makes you careful. And sometimes being careful is smart. But Emma looked so sad... What do you think might help Emma feel better? And they talked about it, really talked. Sophie came up with the idea of making Emma a card telling her all the reasons she was wonderful. Richard offered to help her make it extra special with colored paper and markers. It was the first real problem they'd solved together since Claire died. But the biggest breakthrough came about 2 months into therapy, during what Dr. Chun would later describe as the elephant in the room session. Sophie had brought Mr. Wrinkles to therapy that day, which wasn't unusual. But instead of holding him in her lap like she usually did, she set him on the table between her chair and Richard's. Dr. Chun, she said in her serious 8-year-old voice, I need to tell my daddy something important. Okay, Sophie. What would? You like to tell him? Sophie looked directly at Richard, her brown eyes steady and brave. Daddy, I need to tell you that I'm mad at you. Richard flinched like he'd been slapped. Every instinct told him to correct her, to remind her about respectful behavior, to shut down whatever she was about to say. But Dr. Chung caught his eye and nodded slightly. Trust the process. Tell me why you're mad, baby girl. I'm mad because you made me think I killed Mama. The words hit Richard like a freight train. What? Sophie, no, you didn't. Let me finish, Sophie said, and there was something in her voice that was older than her 8 years. I'm mad because when Mama died, you stopped looking at me like I was your little girl and started looking at me like I was a problem you had to fix. I'm mad because I spent 3 years trying to be perfect so you'd love me again, and you never told me I didn't have to earn it. Richard was crying now, but Sophie wasn't finished. And I'm mad because I'm 8 years old, and I shouldn't have had to go to the police station to find out that daddies are supposed to hug their little girls without looking like it hurts them. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Sophie picked up Mr. Wrinkles and held him out to her father. But I'm not mad enough to not love you anymore. Mr. Wrinkles thinks you were just scared and sad and didn't know how to tell me. Is that right? Richard took the stuffed elephant with shaking hands. That's right, baby girl. I was so scared of losing you that I forgot how to keep you. Are you still scared? every day. But now I'm more scared of losing you by pushing you away than by loving you too much. Sophie considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. Okay, then we should probably practice hugging until you remember that it's not going to disappear. And right there in Dr. Chan's office, between the tissues and the vanilla candles, a father and daughter began the slow work of learning to be a family again. 6 months later, on a warm October afternoon, when the leaves were just starting to think about changing colors, Richard Walker did something he hadn't done in 3.5 years. He took his daughter out for ice cream just because, not because she'd earned enough stars on her behavior chart, not because it was her birthday or she'd gotten good grades or accomplished anything special, just because Dr. Chun had said something that stuck with him. Mr. Walker, when was the last time you did something with Sophie just for the joy of it? And Richard had realized that he couldn't remember. Every interaction with his daughter for the past 3 years had been functional, meals, homework, chores, bedtime routines, nothing spontaneous, nothing just for fun, nothing just because he loved her. So there they were, standing in line at Scoops and Smiles, Sophie bouncing slightly on her toes, as read all the flavors through the glass case. Richard, fighting every anxiety-driven impulse of it, told him this was too indulgent, too frivolous, too risky. What if she got a stomachache? What if she made a mess? What if other people judged him for letting his daughter have ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon for no special reason? But then Sophie looked up at him with those brown eyes that were starting to shine with something that looked like trust again, and said, "Daddy, what's your favorite flavor?" And Richard realized he didn't know. He'd been so focused on being responsible for so long, Thad forgotten his own preferences about simple things like ice cream. "I don't know," he admitted. "What do you think I should try?" Sophie studied the options with the concentration of a judge at a county fair. "I think you should get mint chocolate chip," she said finally. "It's surprising. It looks like it's gonna be regular ice cream, but then it's got all these cool, interesting pieces that make it better." Richard felt something warm unfold in his chest. That sounds perfect. When they got their cones, mint chocolate chip for him, strawberry with extra sprinkles for her, they found a small table by the window. Sophie attacked her ice cream with the enthusiasm of Simeon, who wasn't used to unexpected treats, and within about 30 seconds, she had pink smudges on her cheeks and sprinkles in her hair. 3 years ago, Richard would have immediately started cleaning her up, correcting her table manners, turning even ice cream into a lesson about being neat and careful. But today, watching his daughter discover joy in something as simple as strawberry ice cream with rainbow sprinkles, Richard just smiled. "Daddy, you got a funny look on your face," Sophie said, pausing in her assault on the cone. "What kind of funny look?" Like you're remembering something good." And he was. He was remembering Claire laughing at this same ice cream shop, getting Cocolate sauce on her nose and not caring. He was remembering tiny Sophie, maybe 3 years old, trying to eat a cone bigger than her head while sitting in her mother's lap. But for the first time, those memories didn't hurt. They felt like gifts instead of punishments. "I am remembering something good," he told his daughter. "I'm remembering why your mama loved this place so much." Sophie's face grew serious. They'd been working in therapy on talking about Claire, note avoiding her memory, but not letting grief over her lost poison the present either. "Do you think Mama would like that we're here together?" Richard felt tears start to blur his vision, but they were different tears than the ones he'd been carrying for 3 years. These weren't tears of loss and regret. These were tears of gratitude. "I think your mama would be proud of both of us for finding our way back to each other." Sophie nodded solemnly and returned to her ice cream. But after a moment, she looked. "Back up, Daddy? If I spill some on my shirt, will you still love me?" The question hit Richard like a lightning bolt. After months of therapy, he was finally starting to understand how deeply he'd wounded his daughter's understanding of unconditional love. "Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I will love you if you spill ice cream on your shirt. I will love you if you spill it on my shirt. I will love you if you drop the whole cone on the floor and then slip and fall in it yourself." Sophie giggled at the image. "I will love you when you're happy and when you're sad, when you're good and when you make mistakes, when you're loud and when you're quiet, when you hug me and when you need space. I will love you no matter what, because you're my daughter and loving you isn't something you earn. It's just something that is." Sophie considered this for a long moment. "Even if I get a bad grade on my spelling test, even then. Even if I accidentally break something, even then. Even if I cry during sad movies, especially then." Sophie smiled, the biggest, brightest smile Richard had seen from her since before Claire died. And then, as if testing this new promise of unconditional love, she deliberately tilted her ice cream cone and let a big dollop of strawberry ice cream fall directly onto her white school shirt. Richard's first instinct was panic. His second was laughter. "Well," he said, grinning at his daughter's shocked expression, "I guess we're about to find out if I meant what I said." And he did mean it. Instead of scolding her for making a mess, he grabbed some napkins and helped her clean up while she dissolved into giggles. "You're not mad?" she asked, amazed. "I'm not. Mad, shirts can be washed. Ice cream stains aren't the end of the world. And besides," he leaned closer and whispered conspiratorially, "I was kind of hoping you'd test me." "Why?" "Because now you know for sure that I meant what I said about loving you no matter what." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad tears. They were the kind of tears that come when something broken inside you finally clicks back into place. "I love you too, Daddy, even when you were sad and forgot how to show it." And right there, in that little ice cream shop with its checkered floor and cheerful yellow walls, surrounded by the chatter of other families and the sound of the soft serve machine, Richard Walker finally understood what his wife had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Love isn't something you protect by holding it back. Love is something you strengthen by giving it away. Now, friend, I wish I could tell you that ice cream cones and heartfelt conversations solved everything overnight. But healing isn't a fairy tale. It's more like tending a garden. You plant these seeds, you water them regular, and you wait for the slow miracle of growth. The real test came on a Tuesday night in November. When Sophie woke up screaming, Richard found her sitting bolt upright in her bed, tears streaming down her face, clutching Mr. Wrinkles like he was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "Baby girl, what's wrong?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed, something he'd learned to do in therapy instead of standing in the doorway like he used to. "I dreamed Mama came back," Sophie sobbed. "But when she saw how I'd been living, she got me and said I should have been good enough to keep her from getting sick. She said if I'd been a better daughter, maybe God wouldn't have taken her away." Richard felt his heart break all over again, not just for his daughter's pain, but for the recognition of where that terrible logic had come from. He'd never said those words to Sophie directly, but in 100 small ways, he'd taught her that love was conditional, that good behavior could somehow protect you from loss, that if you were just perfect enough, maybe the people you loved wouldn't leave. "Sophie," he said, pulling her into his arms, "can I tell you something about your mama?" She nodded against his chest. "Your mama didn't get sick because you weren't good enough. She got sick because sometimes bad things happen to good people, and it's nobody's fault. Not yours, not mine, not even God's. It just ... happened. But if I'd been better..." "Stop right there." Richard's voice was gentle but firm. "Your mama loved you exactly as you were. She loved your loud laugh and your messy room and the way you'd get chocolate on your face when you ate ice cream. She didn't love you because you were perfect. She loved you because you were Sophie? Then why did she leave? It was the question Richard had been dreading for 3 years, the one he'd been too brave to answer honestly. She didn't want to leave, baby girl. She fought so hard to stay with us. Every day for 2 years, she fought that cancer with everything. She had because she loved us too much to give up. But sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, no matter how much love you have, your body just stops working. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Did you think it was your fault, too? She finally asked. Richard closed his eyes, remembering those dark months when Claire was dying, when he'd bargained with God and blamed himself and wondered what he could have done differently. Yeah, sweetheart, I did. I thought maybe if I'd made her go to the doctor sooner, or if I'd been a better husband, or if I'd prayed harder, I thought maybe I could have saved her. Is that why you stopped hugging me? Because you thought loving people made them go away? The clarity of his 8-year-old's understanding took Richard's breath away. I think that's exactly what I thought. I was so scared of losing you too that I tried to love you from a distance. But all I did was lose you anyway, just in a different way. Sophie pulled back to look at her father's face in the dim light from her nightlight. Daddy, can I tell you a secret? Of course. Sometimes when you wouldn't hug me, I pretended that you were still sad about Mama, and that's why you couldn't show love right now. But deep down, I thought maybe I was just too broken to love. Richard felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart with both hands. Oh, baby girl, you're not broken. You were never broken. I was the one who was broken, and let my broken pieces cut you. Are we both fixed now? Richard considered the question seriously. Were they fixed? Or were they just learning how to function? With their scars? I don't think people ever get completely fixed, he said finally. But I think we can learn how to be broken and still love each other well. Sophie nodded like this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old wisdom. Daddy, will you stay here until I fall asleep? 3 years ago, Richard would have said no. Would have cited the importance of independence, of not creating bad habits, of teaching her to self-soothe. Tonight, he said, I'll stay as long as you need me to. And he did. He sat beside Sophie's bed, holding her hand until her breathing evened out and she drifted back to sleep. Then he sat there a little longer, just watching his daughter's face in the soft glow of her nightlight, marveling at the resilience of children and the grace of second chances. That's when he noticed the drawing taped to her bedside table. One he hadn't seen before. It was a picture of 2 stick figures, one big and one small, standing in front of a house. The big figure had its arms open wide, and the small figure was running toward it. At the bottom, in Sophie's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, Daddy learning how to hug. Richard had to bite his knuckle to keep from crying and waking her up. Spring came early that year, arriving with a warmth that seemed to seep into more than just the ground. Sophie's school had a butterfly garden, and she'd been checking it every day since the weather turned, looking for any sign of the caterpillar. She and Emma had relocated the year before. I know it's probably not the same one, she told Richard over breakfast one morning. Dr. Chenzi's, sometimes we want things to connect, even when they don't really. But I still like to look. Richard smiled at his daughter's mature way of processing hope and disappointment. Therapy had been good for both of them. Sophie was learning that feelings were meant to be felt, no turned, and Richard was learning that his job as a father wasn't to protect Sophie from all pain, but to help her navigate it. Even if it's not the same caterpillar, maybe its butterfly children are there, Richard suggested. Butterfly children, Sophie repeated, giggling. I like that. After school. That day, Sophie burst through the front door with an energy Richard hadn't seen in years. "Daddy, Daddy, you have to come see. Right now." "What is it, baby girl?" "The butterflies. They're everywhere. The garden is full of them, and they're so beautiful. And I think maybe one of them really is from our caterpillar." Richard looked at his daughter's shining face, at the joy radiating from every inch of her small body, and made a decision that would have been impossible for him a year ago. "Let me get my keys." They drove to Sophie's school, where she led him to the butterfly garden with the enthusiasm of Simeon giving a tour of paradise. And she was right. The garden was alive with monarchs, their orange and black wings catching the afternoon sunlight like stained glass windows. "Look, Daddy," Sophie whispered, pointing to a butterfly that had landed on the same bush where they'd found the caterpillar. "I think that's the one." Richard knew it almost certainly wasn't the same insect. But looking at his daughter's face, watching her find wonder in the possibility of transformation and continuity, he understood something profound. It didn't matter if it was the same caterpillar. What mattered was that Sophie could still believe in miracles. What mattered was that she could witness something beautiful and want to share it with him. What mattered was that he was there to see it. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it. They sat on the garden bench for almost an hour, watching butterflies dance from flower to flower, talking about metamorphosis and seasons, and how sometimes the most beautiful things come from the darkest places. "Daddy," Sophie said as they were getting ready to leave, "do you think Mama would have liked butterflies?" It was a question that would have sent Richard spiraling into grief a year ago. Now it felt like an invitation to remember Claire with joy instead of pain. Your Mama would have loved them. She always said that butterflies were proof that change could be beautiful. Sophie considered this. Maybe that's what happened to us. Maybe we were like caterpillars and we had to go through the dark, scary part before we could learn how to fly. Richard looked at his 8-year-old daughter, this wise, resilient, forgiving little person who had somehow managed to love him through his worst moments, and felt something shift inside his chest. "Yeah, baby girl. I think that's exactly what happened." By the time summer rolled around, the Walker house on Maple Street looked different to any Onwo cared to notice. The picket fence had a fresh coat of white paint. The porch swing had been repaired and actually held people now. You could often see Richard and Sophie there in the evenings, reading together or just talking about their days. The windows that had once seemed hollow and empty now glowed with warm light, and if Yao walked past on a Saturday morning, you might hear music coming from the kitchen and the sound of laughter, mixing pancake batter. But the biggest changes weren't visible from the street. The behavior chart was gone from the refrigerator, replaced by Sophie's artwork and photos from their weekly adventure days, trips to the park, the zoo, the library, the ice cream shop that had become their special place. Sophie's room, which had once been a sterile showcase of perfect behavior, now looked like a place where a real child lived. Books scattered on the desk, art projects in various stages of completion, and yes, occasionally clothes on the floor, which Richard had learned to see as evidence of a child who felt safe enough to be imperfect. The most significant change, though, was in the sounds of the house. Where once there had been careful silence, punctuated by the necessary exchanges of functional family life, now there was the rich cacophony of people who enjoyed each other's company. Sophie's laughter rang out freely now, unmonitored and unrestricted. Richard had learned Tola too. Really laugh? Not just the polite chuckles he'd been rationing for years. They talked during dinner now. Real conversations about Sophie's friends, her thoughts about books she was reading, her dreams for the future, her memories of her mother. Richard shared stories from his workday, his own childhood, his plans for improving the house. They were becoming friends, father and daughter. Not just caretaker in charge, but genuine companions who chose to spend time together. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch swing watching fireflies begin their nightly dance, Sophie asked a question that caught Richard off guard. "Daddy, do you think we should tell other people about what happened to us?" "What do you mean?" "Like, about how we almost lost each other because we forgot how to show love. Dr. Chun says that sometimes telling your story can help other people who might be going through the same thing." Richard had been thinking about this himself. During the parenting classes, he'd met other fathers who were struggling with similar issues, men who'd lost their way in grief, who were raising children from a distance because intimacy felt too dangerous, who'd confused providing with loving. "What? Would you want to tell them?" he asked. Sophie thought for a moment, swinging her legs gently. "I think I'd want to tell them that it's okay to be scared of losing people you love, but you can't protect them by not loving them. And I'd want to tell kids that if their grown-ups are acting weird and sad, it's probably not because of something they did wrong." Richard felt that familiar swell of pride and amazement at his daughter's wisdom. "Those are good things to tell people. And I think I'd want to tell them that asking for help isn't giving up. It's just admitting that love is too important. Figure out all by yourself." Richard pulled Sophie closer on the swing, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "When did you get so wise?" "I think I was always wise," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "I just forgot for a while because I thought being wise meant being quiet. But being wise really means knowing when to speak up." As they sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the chorus of summer insects and the gentle creak of the porch swing, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, if someone had told him that his daughter would walk into a police station and ask 5 words that would change both their lives forever, he would have been horrified. Now he was grateful. Grateful that Sophie had been brave enough to ask for help when he couldn't see they needed it. Grateful for Officer Grayson's wisdom and compassion. Grateful for Janet Morrison's patience and Dr. Chun's guidance. Grateful for a system that recognized emotional neglect as real neglect, worthy of intervention and support. Most of all, grateful for second chances and the resilience of love. Word travels fast in small towns, and Millbrook was no exception. The story of the little girl host 5 words at the police station had made its way through the community in the way that important stories do, quietly at first, then gathering momentum as people recognize and think significant in what had happened. It started with Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had watched Sophie after school for 3 years. She began telling her friends about the changes she'd witnessed in the Walker household, how the little girl who used to creep through her days like she was afraid of taking up too much space had blossomed into a child who laughed out loud and asked for second helpings and hugged without hesitation. Then Officer Grayson started including Sophie's story, with permission, in her community outreach talks about recognizing signs of emotional neglect. Not all abuse leaves bruises, Schuwald. Tell audiences of teachers, coaches, and community leaders. Sometimes it just leaves children who apologize for existing. Dr. Chun began using their case study in her training sessions for other family therapists, illustrating how grief can distort love into something unrecognizable and how healing requires not just addressing the symptoms, but understanding the underlying wounds. But perhaps the most important ripple effects were the ones that couldn't be measured or documented. Like Tom Richardson, a widower 2 towns over, who heard Sophie's story from his sister and realized that he'd been making the same mistakes with his own 10-year-old son. Tom had been so afraid of showing weakness in his grief that he'd been raising his boy to be emotionally self-sufficient to the point of isolation. After hearing about the Walkers, Tom signed up for his own family therapy sessions. 6 months later, he and his son Marcus were planning weekend camping trips and having bedtime conversations about feelings and memories and dreams for the future. Like Sarah Martinez, a teacher at Sophie's school who started recognizing the signs of emotional neglect in some of her other students. Children who were too eager to please, too apologetic, too careful about taking up space or asking for help. Sarah created a program she called Butterfly Conversations, regular check-ins with students that had nothing to do with academic performance and everything to do with emotional well-being. Just 15 minutes a week where children could talk about their feelings without judgment, where they could learn that their inner worlds mattered, like Judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over the Walker case and started advocating for more family preservation programs that focused on healing rather than punishment. She worked with the county to expand funding for family therapy services and parenting education, recognizing that sometimes the difference between a broken family and a healing family was access to the right support. The ripples spread outward, touching lives in ways that Richard and Sophie would never fully know. But they did know about some of them, like the letter they received from a father in Alabama. Dear Mr. Walker and Sophie, I heard your story through a friend who works in child services. I want you to know that it probably saved my family. After my wife died last year, I've been raising my twin daughters the way I thought I was supposed to, making sure they were fed and clothed and doing well in school, but keeping my distance because I was afraid of falling apart in front of them. When I heard about Sophie asking if every daddy acts like hers, I realized my girls were probably wondering the same thing. So I asked them, and they were. We're in therapy now, all three of us. My girls are learning that it's okay to miss their mama out loud, and I'm learning that they need their daddy's heart, not just his paycheck. Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help, Sophie. And thank you for being brave enough to learn how to love better, Mr. Walker. You've given our family a roadmap back to each other. With gratitude, Michael Patterson and daughters Emma and Grace. Sophie cried when Richard read her that letter. Not sad tears, but the kind of tears that come when you realize your pain might have served a purpose. Daddy, she said, do you think that's why hard things happen sometimes? So we can learn how to help other people going through hard things too? Richard thought about the question seriously. He'd been asking himself similar things lately, whether there was meaning to be found in their struggles, whether their story could be a light for their families, walking through their own darkness. I don't know if that's why hard things happen, he said finally, but I think it might be what we can do with them after they're over. 1 year to the day after Sophie had walked into Millbrook Police Department and asked for 5 world-changing words, she and Richard returned to that same building. Not because anything was wrong, not because they needed help or intervention or rescue. They returned because Officer Grayson had asked them to. I'm giving a presentation to new officers about recognizing and responding to emotional neglect, she'd explained over the phone. I was wondering if you too would be willing to share your story, help them understand what recovery looks like. Sophie had been immediately enthusiastic about the idea. At 9 years old, she had developed a deep sense of justice and fairness, and she liked the idea of helping other children who might be living in houses where love had gotten lost. Richard had been more hesitant, not from shame, but from a desire to protect their privacy. But when Sophie pointed out that sharing their story might help other daddies learn how to hug without looking sad, he agreed. The police station looked different to Sophie now. A year ago, it had felt like a last resort, a place she'd come when she'd run out of other options for making sense of her world. Now, it felt like the beginning of their family's new story. Officer Grayson introduced them to the room full of new recruits, explaining the context of their first meeting. Then she asked Sophie if she wanted to tell the officers what had brought her to the station that rainy morning. Sophie stood up straight, holding Mr. Wrinkles, who still accompanied her to important events, and spoke with a clarity that had first impressed Officer Grayson. I came here because I needed to know if the way my daddy was acting was normal. I thought maybe all daddies stopped hugging their kids after mamas died, and maybe I was being too needy by wanting more love than I was getting. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of these men and women who had chosen careers in helping people. But Officer Grayson told me that daddies are supposed to love their kids out loud, not just on the inside where nobody can see it. And that started everything getting better. One of the officers raised her hand. Sophie, what would you want other kids in your situation to know? Sophie considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. I would want them to know that grown-ups sometimes get confused about love, especially when they're really sad about something. But that doesn't mean the love isn't there. It's just hiding behind all the hurt. And sometimes grown-ups need help finding it again. Another officer asked, "What made you brave enough to come here and ask for help?" I wasn't feeling very brave, Sophie admitted. I was feeling scared and confused and kind of angry. But I remembered something my mama used to tell me before she got sick. She said that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing the right thing anyway. The room was completely silent, full of adults learning from a child's wisdom. Then Richard stepped forward. "I want you all to know," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "that what you do here matters more than you might realize. When my daughter walked through that door a year ago, she was carrying pain that I had caused, not intentionally, but caused nonetheless." Officer Grayson could have dismissed her concerns, could have called it a family matter, and sent her home. He looked over at Maria Grayson, who was wiping tears from her eyes. Instead, she listened. She took a child's question seriously. She saw emotional neglect as real neglect, worthy of intervention and support. And because of that, my daughter and I got a second chance to learn how to be a family. Richard's voice broke slightly. Sophie saved our family by being brave enough to ask for help. But Officer Grayson saved our family by being wise enough to provide it. When the presentation ended, several officers approached Sophie and Richard privately. One young officer, barely out of training, told them that their story had helped her understand her own childhood differently. "My dad never hit me or anything," she said, "but after my mom left, he kind of shut down emotionally. I spent years thinking I wasn't worth loving because he couldn't show affection anymore. I wish someone had explained to me what you just explained to these officers, that sometimes grown-ups get confused about love when they're hurting." An older officer shared that he'd been struggling with his own teenage daughter since his divorce, maintaining what he thought was appropriate distance, but now recognizing as emotional withdrawal. "I think I need to have some conversations with my kid," he said, "and maybe get us both into therapy." As they drove home from the police station, Sophie asked Richard a question that had been forming in her mind throughout the day. "Daddy, do you think we're different people now than we were a year ago?" Richard thought about this carefully. Were they different? Or had they simply remembered who they were meant to be? "I think we're the same people," he said finally, "but we're better versions of ourselves. Like we're living in black and white before, and now we're living in color." Sophie nodded, satisfied with this answer. "I like living in color better,"